Hi everyone, I'm Mandy Moreno, the Choral GTA at the University of North Dakota, and this is the fourth in a series of videos created for the choral department of UND on body mapping concepts. Today is the second of two breathing videos. The first one will be linked in the description below, and the description below will also include my contact info through the university, my office hours for the remainder of this semester, as well as other body mapping resources that you can check out for yourself. So a common misconception about breath support is that we must exert unnatural effort in order to do something that is, quite frankly, completely natural. Breathing is not supposed to be something that we have to think about. It's meant to be free, easy, and completely natural. The body is designed to breathe on its own. Two definitions of the word support are: number one, to bear or hold up a structure or mass. Two, to uphold by aid, to back up, to second. Given the opportunity, your body, the skeletal and muscular structures, will provide the necessary support, especially if you have learned to find freedom and balance within your body. But it can be vastly more challenging to do so if we allow unnecessary tension to creep in, quite frankly, by overthinking things, by adding in that unnecessary effort to something that is meant to be natural. So this video will dig into some of the key elements, the key players of the breathing activity and how they impact singing. First, let's review a few things. Number one, we have the 6 places of dynamic balance. Again, these places, when aligned vertically, allow your body to balance top to bottom in such a way as to have greater ease and freedom in your music making. So from top to bottom, they are the atlanto-occipital joint, the shoulder joint, the lumbar vertebrae, the hip joint, the knee joint, and the ankle joint. My first video tapped into each one of these briefly. The second video dug into the atlanto-occipital joint, and videos to follow this one will continue from the shoulder joint down. I think it's the shoulder joint. It might be the lumbar vertebrae. Either way, there will be videos for each place. A second point of review are the 4 laws of the spine as dictated by body mapping literature. And the first is that the head leads spinal movement from the AO joint. That's where it begins, is what we're saying. Law number 2, the spine follows in sequence. So the head leads and the spine follows in sequence. Number 3, the spine must be free to lengthen and gather in movement and with breathing. I referenced that in the previous breathing video, and we'll reference it again later in this one. And 4, movement is evenly distributed across the spine. There's not one part of the spine that bears the movement. All of it bears it together in an even distribution. So now let's move on to other organs and body parts and steps, if you will, of the breathing process. First, we have the ribs, which swing outward and up. The excursion of the ribs is what we call that. And you can see in this diagram, when they are at rest, when you have finished exhaling, they are in a more downward positioning and slightly closer to each other. When you inhale, they swing outwards away from each other and further up. This movement sort of stretches the lungs, if you will, to open more as they fill with air. Your lungs are not balloons that just fill completely with air. And in the description below, there is a link to a video about lung activity, and what is inside the lungs, the alveoli and all those other things that the air moves through, as opposed to just filling up all at once. However, in order for the air to get into all those little places, the ribs stretch the lungs out a little bit from the sides, because the lungs are connected to the ribs from the inside. That sentence didn't totally make sense, but I think you understand what I'm saying. If you don't, check out the other video. There's a plug. Speaking of the lungs, they are massive organs, you can see right there in the image, that fill the thoracic cavity, which is the area between the diaphragm and your throat. So if you find the bottom of your rib cage at the center, which for me is right there, and then your clavicle, which is that bone right up here, your collarbone is another term, that whole space is filled with lung tissue. They're huge. I'm going to introduce my friend Steve. And poor Steve's rib cage is a little inaccurate, but it'll serve. So if you look at that diagram and then look at Steve, all of this space is filled essentially with lung, except for the few bottom ribs. So pretty much all the way across here. They're huge. Below the lungs, then, we have the diaphragm. The diaphragm is also quite large. It is a dome-shaped organ, as in a dome, that spans the entire area between the thoracic cavity on top and the abdominal cavity below. And the diaphragm moves up and down during the breathing activity. And because it is an involuntary organ, it moves on its own, regardless of whether or not you think about it. We often, voice teachers, well, really all kinds of people, when referencing singing, will say, breathe from your diaphragm. Well, you're going to do that anyway. You can't stop it. So it's kind of an unnecessary direction. However, understanding what the diaphragm does can be a crucial element in understanding your overall breathing activity. Continuing. Beneath the diaphragm is the entire abdominal cavity, which contains all your viscera. That would be all of the other organs, the stomach, the kidneys, the liver, the intestines, all of those things sit in the abdominal cavity beneath the diaphragm. As you inhale, the diaphragm pushes down against the viscera and pushes the viscera outwards against the abdominal wall to the front, the sides, and the back. So again, he's not super helpful because he's just bones, but your diaphragm, which would sit right in here, pushes down and pushes all the viscera elsewhere. Sort of like if you push your hand in the middle of a rubber ball and it kind of goes out to the side, similar to that. The diaphragm also pushes all of your viscera down towards the pelvic floor, which I'll show in a moment. But when you exhale, the diaphragm then releases back up, or it's called elastic recoil, releases back upward into its dome position until you inhale again, when it will go back down to that downward position. The pelvic floor is rather like a mirror image of the diaphragm, both in that domed shape and also in the upward and downward movement, inspiring some people to call it the pelvic diaphragm. I'm going to use Steve here to give you an idea. Here is the pelvic structure. I did not choose an image or a video to go along with this because it's kind of awkward, but Steve will help. So the pelvic floor, those muscles stretch all the way down in this space. When you inhale, both your main diaphragm and then the pelvic floor both descend. The diaphragm up here is pushing down the viscera, which pushes down on the pelvic diaphragm. So it is somewhat involuntary and somewhat voluntary. The fact remains, though, that it moves in the same direction and fashion as the main diaphragm. And so with all of these, while all of these inhalation activities are happening, so too is the gathering of the spine, which I discussed in my previous video. And voila. As you inhale, again, the spine gathers in towards your center. As you exhale, it then lengthens back out. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail right now because it is fairly well detailed in the previous video, but I wanted to give you the visual reminder of how that works. So then as we exhale, the exact opposite of all those things happen. The lungs empty their air, the ribs move back down and in, the diaphragm and the pelvic floor ascend, they go back to that higher position, and the spine, as mentioned here, lengthens back to its resting position. So what does all this mean for your singing? Once you have an understanding of how all these parts function both independently and together, you can allow your body to function naturally without overthinking it, because you can also now turn your thoughts towards the air that you're actually using in the breathing activity. Singers and wind players have the opportunity to choose how much air they take in. Too much breath will leave you with excess air inside your lungs and cause what we refer to as back pressure. Because there's nowhere for that air to go once you've taken in a new inhalation, you may feel some actual pressure in your back. Preventing this pressure requires attention to specific individual phrases in your music so that effective inhalation and exhalation are possible. In my own voice lessons, for example, we would take the largest possible amount of air that I needed in, or that I could, and then sing the phrase or buzz the phrase or whatever you and your instructor decide to do. and experience how much air it actually took versus how much excess I also had. And then over time, you practice adjusting that amount of air from your inhalation so that eventually your body understands what it's like to take in the amount of air you need without having excess. It can be a painstaking process, but it's also something that your body will learn and recall in other music. I strongly recommend that you put that practice into your habit of your own music making. It can make a huge difference to your breathing apparatus and your breathing activity. An additional item to consider is unnecessary tension in the abdominal wall. A great many vocal educators will place a strong emphasis on the abdominal muscles. I myself used to tell my students to activate those muscles or flex them or intensify them, if you will, to assist in singing longer and louder and higher. I used to say your abs are your best friends. However, this is tension. Activating your muscles in that way creates tension, unnecessary tension. And such tension can impede the movement of the abdominal wall, which impedes the movement of the viscera, which impedes the downward movement of the diaphragm and the ribs and the lungs and so on and so forth. Your abdominal muscles, believe it or not, pretty much know how to do what it is they need to do when you breathe without your help. You can let them do it. It is valuable to know where they are and to understand what they do. Let them work on their own. They will support you in the ways most needed. As I said, have put some additional videos in the description below for further their animations and some descriptions of rib movement is an animation, of lung movement is actually a descriptive video, and diaphragm movement. There's both a diaphragm animation and then there's also a video on diaphragmatic breathing. It's one in a series of 3 with the other 2 videos focusing on diaphragmatic breathing when you're laying down and also while you're sitting. They are great videos. They're very informative and definitely debunk some of the things that we sometimes think when we don't have accurate information. So I hope that these 2 videos, the previous breathing part 1 and this breathing part 2, have given you some new information to think about in regard to your breathing. Get you a pool noodle, get you an exercise ball, use those things to help feel the movement, to feel the excursion of the ribs, to feel the lengthening and gathering of the spine, to really experience how your body moves when it breathes so that you can feel confident in the knowledge that when you breathe, it is breathing as it should. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to comment below or email me. It has been a pleasure to bring you some breathing information today. Have a great day.